Hello and welcome back to Crime on the Clarkfork, the true crime podcast where I tell you about big crimes that happen in small places, where each case occurs in areas with populations of 15,000 or less. My name is Mackenzie Spence and I'm your host. And if you listen on Spotify, can you do me a huge favor and turn on automatic downloads? This will help the algorithm recommend this show to others. And if you want to be notified every single time an episode goes live, you're also able to click the little bell button on that show page, and it will send you a notification when I upload a new episode. If this is your first time here, welcome. I'm so excited that you are here and listening, and I'm excited that we are to episode 15 of this podcast. So I don't have a lot of other things to say to start out. I have dislocated my knee for the third time, so that's a really fun thing that's going on in my life. Not so fun, actually. And we had our false spring, and then it snowed again, so I'm ready for the snow to melt and for mud season to be here in the spring and all the flowers to start blooming. But alas, we are back into that second winter that, if you're from Montana, you know all too well. So, I'm just going to jump right in. The sources for this episode are the U.S. Census Bureau, NBC Montana, India Times, the Missoulian, Ravalli County News, Web Sleuths, Unilad, Hub Pages, Reddit, The Charlie Project, AllTrails, the Doe Network, and Deep Lore. And if you couldn't tell based on the sources for this episode, we are back in Montana. Huge thank you to Colleen for recommending this case. I do love covering the Montana cases. I'm a little biased since that's my home and the place I love. I do try to jump around quite a bit. So episode 16, we're actually hopping out of the United States. And that's all I'm going to say on that. You'll have to wait and find out where we're going when the time comes. So, we are heading back to Montana, back to my home state. Victor, Montana, 2007, population 774. It was July 18th, 2007, when 55-year-old Barbara Bollick disappeared while hiking in Montana's Bitterroot Valley. Barbara was no stranger to the Montana wilderness that she was traversing that day, which makes her disappearance even more peculiar. The morning of July 18th, at around 8:30 or 9 a.m., Carl, Barbara's husband, spoke with her, and she told him that she was going on a hike with Jim Ramaker, Carl's cousin Donna's boyfriend. So, Carl's cousin's name is Donna, Jim is Donna's boyfriend, just because that was a little confusing. Donna and Jim were visiting the couple from California, and Carl's cousin Donna was also supposed to go hiking that morning, but she had too many drinks the night before and decided to not go after all. Now, the hike that they were going on did not surprise or worry Carl, because Barbara was an avid hiker, a strong hiker, and was always prepared for anything that may come up in the woods while hiking. She also brought everyone that came to visit them to this particular hike, as it was generally easy and it had incredible scenery of the Bitterroot Valley. Carl told Barbara that she didn't have to worry about dinner that night and he would take care of it, and she replied and told him that she would see him a little bit later before she walked out the door. Shortly after this conversation, Barbara and Jim headed to the wilderness to start their trek. The hike that they were going on is called Bear Creek Overlook. And Bear Creek Overlook is an out and back hike that's nearly 5 miles, so about 2.5 miles up, 2.5 miles back, with over 1,000 feet of elevation gain. It's actually a pretty popular trail, but it can also be quiet depending on the day and time that you decide to go. And Jim and Barbara made this hike on a Wednesday morning. So they made their way to the overlook, which is the turnaround point of the trail, and the two decided to stay there to enjoy the view and have a quick snack before heading back down the trail and heading home. While Jim and Barbara were taking their break at the overlook, they ran into two men who were also on the trail, and they chatted for a little bit before the two men walked away, heading down the trail back to the trailhead. Overall, Jim and Barbara rested at that overlook for around 30 to 40 minutes before they started their journey back down the mountain. At around 11:30 a.m., Jim stopped for a minute to take in the breathtaking views one last time. When he paused, Barbara was probably 20 or 30 feet away from him further down the trail, but when he turned to continue their journey, less than a minute later, there was no sign of Barbara, and he was alone in the Montana wilderness. He immediately started searching the area for Barbara while calling out her name, but he was met with silence and no sign of Barbara or her things that she was carrying with her. He did end up going down the trail thinking Barbara may have not noticed that he had stopped, but he didn't run into her as he was walking down the trail either. At around noon that day, Carl, Barbara's husband, was working on a carpentry project, and his cousin Donna began to worry that Jim and Barbara hadn't returned to the house. Carl, on the other hand, wasn't really concerned since Barbara was such an avid hiker, she knew the area, and she had a .357 Magnum pistol with her in her day pack. He knew that she would take care of herself as she rarely went too far off the established trail, and she was afraid of heights, so she wouldn't get close to any edges where she could possibly fall. An hour and a half went by, and by 1:30 p.m., Carl's cousin was even more concerned. Carl told her to calm down, and there was a possibility that Jim and Barbara may have gotten a flat tire, or they had just lost track of time. That comforted Donna for about an hour or half an hour, but then she told Carl that he needed to call someone about Jim and Barbara not returning to the house yet. At around that time that she told him he needed to call, Carl's phone rang. It was 2 p.m. when Carl received a phone call from a Forest Service law enforcement officer. Carl knew something was wrong immediately. The officer asked him if his wife's name was Barbara. When he said yes, the officer informed him that she had actually been reported missing. He immediately got into his car and quickly headed to the Bear Creek Outlook to search for his wife. While he drove the 20 minutes to the trailhead, he thought that this was just a mistake and Barbara would be waiting for him when he got there. Unfortunately, the only person who was waiting for him at that trailhead was the Forest Service officer who had called him. Carl stayed at the trailhead and the overlook, searching for his wife until at least midnight, which is when the others on that search team told him that he needed to go home and get some rest before returning in the morning. Carl reluctantly agreed and headed home, but he did return early the next morning with friends and neighbors to continue searching for Barbara. Now, it isn't uncommon for people who are comfortable in the wilderness to go off trail, whether that's to go to the bathroom, to pick some huckleberries, or if you're like me and my boyfriend, to look at a cool rock or pick up a cool rock. And with that in mind, the authorities meticulously searched the area that Jim and Barbara were hiking for any signs of her. They had even included the use of scent dogs, but even the dogs were unable to track her or pick up a scent. On top of the authorities searching, there were also volunteer organizations and special search and rescue teams deployed, as well as aircrafts using infrared and thermal imaging, but Barbara and her belongings were never found. And it was as if she just disappeared into thin air and didn't exist at all. The other weird thing is that area, the Bear Creek Overlook, is covered in a lot of loose shale rock, and at the top it's not incredibly dense with trees. And if you're not familiar with shale, when you walk on it, it's very, very noisy. So the chance of someone creeping on it or creeping up on Barbara on it, or even running, like without making any noise, is incredibly unlikely. If someone had grabbed her, it's very, very unlikely that Jim wouldn't have heard what was going on if he was only 20 or 30 feet away from her. So, the morning of Barbara's disappearance, the road to the trailhead was actually blocked off about a mile down the hill because the Forest Service was replacing a culvert in the road. And when the crew arrived that morning to replace this culvert, there were already 2 cars parked at that closure sign. One was Jim's car, and the other was a light-colored SUV that was on the older side, possibly a Chevy Blazer, and it did have Missoula County license plates. So if you're not familiar with Montana and our license plates, we have over 100 options. Now, I'm not sure what the options looked like back at the time of this case, but if you're in Montana and you have a just regular standard license plate and not one of the other 100 you can choose from, the first number that's on your license plate corresponds to a county in the state of Montana that your car is registered to. So a Missoula County license plate will start with a 4, and then it'll have a dash, and then it'll have some numbers. So that's how they know it's a Missoula County license plate, is they saw that number 4. So back to the story, just so you have some understanding of what that meant. So once the crew began their work for the day, 2 younger men with a black collie with white markings actually walked through the construction site back to the car. Both of the men were tan and fit and stopped to talk to the crew just for a little bit before heading back to their car to leave, the car with the Missoula plates. After chatting for a bit, the 2 men just took off on their way. Around 45 minutes after speaking with the 2 young men, Jim walked onto the construction site, asking the crew if they had seen Barbara. They told him that they hadn't, but they would walk him back to his car to see if she was there, maybe waiting for him. When Jim saw that she wasn't there, he actually hiked back to the overlook, and about an hour later, Jim returned to that construction site again without Barbara and told the crew that he needed help because he couldn't find her anywhere. Authorities did attempt to locate the 2 men that Jim and Barbara had stopped and talked to before she disappeared, the same 2 men, assumingly, that the construction crew saw, but they were unable to locate them, and no one ever came forward admitting to be them. There was even a $10,000 reward for information about them, stating that they weren't in trouble and they could have even come forward themselves to collect the money. Authorities did believe that the men were from the Missoula area based on their license plate and the fact that they were hiking on a Wednesday morning. and they were hoping to speak to them to confirm that Barbara was there that morning, because the only things that authorities have to go off of are Jim's account. And to this day of this podcast, the men have not come forward. And this could be due to the fact that Barbara's disappearance was not widely broadcasted in the media, or the men may have not been from Montana at all. They could have been visiting, and it could have been a rental car or a car they were borrowing from a friend. There's also a chance that they were, or even still are, unaware that they're being looked for, or that the woman they spoke to, Barbara, on the trail that day, even disappeared. On top of this, Jim states that he stopped to look around 11:30 a.m., but in reality, the window of time that Barbara could have disappeared varied based on Jim's account of events, and she really could have disappeared any time between 11:30 a.m. and 1 p.m., which is a rather large time frame. So that's another reason that authorities really wanted to speak to these men to see what time or around what time they had run into Barbara and Jim at the top of the overlook. So authorities sent out a call for any information that they could get from the public, and many people sent in tips about Barbara's disappearance, but none of them were helpful in solving the case. There were many tips that really led to nothing, and there was even one tip that Barbara was abducted by a ghostly mountain man. So, maybe, who knows, right? So, Jim eventually went back to California, but he was cooperative and returned all of the calls from authorities. And at one point, he even offered to take a lie detector test, but authorities didn't think that it was really necessary, so it was never done. And the police ultimately cleared Jim of any suspicion in the case. Now, just a little bit about Carl and Barbara. So, Carl and Barbara met when Carl was an Air Force officer and he was stationed in New Jersey. It was 2001 when Barbara and Carl moved to Montana. Carl had just retired from 17 long years working for J.P. Morgan as an assistant director of worldwide security operations, and Carl had grown up in Dillon, Montana, so it was really a simple move for him, and Barbara was enamored by the beauty of Montana and the outdoor lifestyle and hobbies that were just out her back door. At first, the couple moved to Dillon, Montana, but Barbara didn't like the wind and cold of Carl's hometown, and at one point, the two actually traveled to the Bitterroot Valley, and Barbara immediately fell in love, which caused them to purchase some land in Darby, Montana in 2001, before settling into a house that was located in Darby. Even before moving to Montana, Barbara was an avid hiker and was rather athletic. She very quickly adapted to the Montana lifestyle that was available to her just outside of her new home. At the time of her disappearance, Barbara was actually taking pilot lessons and was really excited to get her pilot's license. She was also learning how to ski. She often hiked in the Bitterroot Valley and would run every single day. Carl used to hike with Barbara, but he had a heart attack, which then caused him to not be able to go with her anymore, which is why he didn't accompany Jim and Barbara on the hike that morning. Now, even though Carl couldn't hike with her anymore, it didn't stop Barbara from hiking every single canyon in the valley, and she would often hike the Bear Creek Overlook, which was her favorite hike that she had done. Carl passed away in 2021 at 80 years old, and he never got to see his wife after that day in 2007, but he never gave up hope that she would one day turn up. Now, there are a few theories that have come out about Barbara and her disappearance. The first is that she disappeared on purpose. She was an avid hiker and she knew the area well, and it wouldn't be hard to hide in the Montana wilderness and get away, especially if you're hiking with a person who is unfamiliar with the area. With this, it is a lot harder than some people may think to disappear and just remake a new life. And when looking at a map of this area, the terrain is rather rough, but there are some logging roads, so I suppose if she could have gotten away, she could have hopped on to one of those logging roads in that area. And on top of that, the area that she did go missing is rather forested, aside from the top of the overlook where it's less forested. And if you head west, really the only thing you would be able to do would be to go to the top of the mountain for the views or continue further into the wilderness because there are no towns out there. If you do go east, that's when you run into the valley, so Victor, Darby, Corvallis area. And I don't buy this theory because Carl was adamant that Barbara would never just up and leave. And he says that she would never have left her dog, her cat, her wallet, her ID, her passport, and he knows that she would have never done something like this to her friends and family. And she was also really looking forward to a trip to Mexico that her and Carl were going on a few short months after she had disappeared. With that being said, I know people disappear for a slew of reasons. You never know what goes on behind closed doors. But to me, I just don't think that this theory is true. She had never used any of her bank cards, and had never used her social security number again. And again, if she would have gone west, she would have just made it further into the wilderness. If she would have gone east, she would have made it into town, and people, I would assume, would have seen her. So this is not the theory that I buy into, but it is one that other people have put forward. Another theory is that Barbara was attacked by an animal, but again, to me, this really doesn't seem that plausible. Mountain lions are common in Montana, and they are quiet, but the likelihood of there being no drag marks or blood anywhere just doesn't really sit right with me personally. Also, mountain lions are most active at dawn or dusk, so the likelihood of one attacking a human in the middle of the day would also be really odd. There would have been at least a bit of evidence of this, and Jim would have heard if this did happen, mostly because of that shale rock, and not to mention, the scent dogs would have picked up on her scent in this scenario, because if you don't know, mountain lions generally go for the neck of their prey, so there would have been some blood somewhere. There's also a theory that Barbara fell or maybe tripped into a crevice or cave and didn't have time to call out for help. But, like I said earlier, Barbara had a severe fear of heights, so the likelihood of her getting close and being careless about a crevice or cave is slim. And she knew this area and this hike so well that the likelihood of her accidentally falling into one is also rather low. And again, none of her things were ever found. So if she had fallen, you would have thought that they would be able to find at least some evidence of her belongings in some of the caves and crevices that they did extensive searches of while searching for Barbara. Now, a theory that I, as well as many, many others, have is that Barbara never made it to the trailhead, let alone to the Bear Creek Overlook. This would explain why there were never any signs of her or her belongings on the mountain after thousands of hours of searching. It would also explain why scent dogs were unable to pick up any scent of her on the trail. Also, with there being so much shale on the trail, her walking away or getting taken without making any noise seems really suspicious to me. And people don't just disappear in 45 seconds. Not to mention, the area she disappeared in, again, wasn't heavily wooded up at that overlook. So even if she did move from where she was standing, the likelihood of her getting to a hiding spot in that amount of time seems improbable, in my opinion. Now, I'm not saying that I 100% think Jim killed her, but I do think there is something else going on. Or, as some others think, maybe Jim did kill her, or something happened before they made it to the trailhead, but Jim needed an alibi. So he still went on to hike to the Bear Creek Overlook, and it also makes me wonder if he even spoke to the two men that day, or if he heard about them when speaking with the Forest Service construction crew that was working on that culvert. The only thing that doesn't quite fit with this theory is if Jim were to kill her, you would have think that he would have made up a better story than her disappearing in 45 seconds while he took in the scenery. But you never know. In 2023, authorities put out a new call for anyone who may have any information around Barbara's disappearance. But unfortunately, nothing has come from that has been released to the public, at least. And not a single piece of evidence has been discovered regarding Barbara Bollick's mysterious disappearance. Today, Barbara would be 73 years old. At the time of her disappearance, she's 5 feet tall, and she weighed 115 pounds. She's Caucasian with brown eyes, pierced ears, and red or auburn hair. She was last seen wearing a pastel-colored shirt, tan shorts, and a black backpack. And that's the end of this case. If you know anything about Barbara, please call the Missoula Police Department or the Ravalli Police Department if you have any information on her disappearance. If you are one of those two men that they have been looking for, maybe come forward and let them know what happened that day while you were hiking the Bear Creek Overlook. And again, that's the end of this case. As always, please give me 5 stars on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as a review on Apple Podcasts. It does help bring this podcast to other people that may be looking for a new true crime podcast to listen to. I'm always looking for cases to cover, so if you have a case suggestion, please visit the link in the show's Instagram page at Crime on the Clarkfork, or send me a DM on the Instagram page as well. Again, thank you, Colleen, for recommending this case. I also post pictures from the cases that I cover on that Instagram page, so if you're interested, go give that a quick follow and let me know what your thoughts are on Barbara's disappearance. What do you think happened? I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will catch you next time with more big crime in small places.